Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our event on community policing from evidence to policymaking. My name is Annette Brown. I'm the principal economist at FHI 360, and FHI 360 is pleased to be co-hosting this event with Evidence in Governance and Politics. For those of you who are not familiar with one or both of our organizations, I will tell you just a few things about us. FHI 360 is an international nonprofit working to improve the health and well-being of people in the United States and around the world. We partner with public and private funders to implement human development programs in sectors including global health, economic development, civil society and peace building, education, crisis response, and other sectors in more than 50 countries around the world. We're also a research institute. We conduct research including clinical trials, implementation science, impact and other evaluations, evidence reviews, and others. Evidence in Governance and Politics, or EGAP, is a research evaluation and learning network. We have academic and institutional members from around the world, and we promote rigorous knowledge accumulation and evidence-based policy in various governance and politics sectors, including accountability, political participation, mitigation of conflict, and reducing inequality. Now I say we because FHI 360 is a proud member of EGAP. EGAP fosters practitioner or institutional and academic collaboration, and today's event is an excellent example of EGAP's commitment to bringing evidence to those who can use it. I want to explain to you a little bit about the agenda for today, and as I do that, I will introduce all four of our esteemed speakers. We'll start with some introductory remarks from Mark Croker. Mark began his policing career spending 32 years at the Los Angeles Police Department, where he rose to the rank of Deputy Chief of Police. After that, he took on a variety of roles, including in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Portland, Oregon, and Liberia, and went on to become police advisor and director of the police division for the UN's Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Mark has also worked in the private sector, including for the Walt Disney Company and PAE. And in all of these roles, he's launched a wide range of community policing initiatives in multiple law enforcement settings. After Mark's remarks, Professor Graham Blair will present to us this Metaketa research on community policing. Graham is assistant professor of political science at UCLA, and he is the lead investigator for this research project. Graham's research I've always enjoyed because he conducts research field experiments like you'll hear about today, but he's also well known for his work on improving research methodology. Graham has published in journals including the American Journal of Political Science, the American Political Science Review, Science Advances, and other prestigious journals. And he's also been awarded several prizes, including the Lima Rosenthal Prize for Open Social Science Research. When Graham's finished, we'll have two discussants who will lead off our discussion. The first is Julie Werble with the United States Agency for International Development. She currently serves as the acting division chief for leadership and learning in the new USAID Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. And she served as the agency's senior security reform advisor for more than a decade. She's also worked in the private sector for DFI services, and before that worked for the Department of Defense and helped to establish the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Our second discussant is Ahmad Gurung. Like Mark, Ahmad began his career in police departments in his own country, Nepal, and held several positions, including district police commander and operational commander. For the last 19 years, he's been with the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations. He's worked in various field missions, including Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen. And in his work, he works with both national and international stakeholders with a special focus on institutional reform, rebuilding of police and other law enforcement institutions. We also want to have you all have an opportunity to ask your questions. Please submit questions at any time during the event using the question and answer function in Zoom. We don't anticipate answering questions in real time, but we will be collecting these questions and I will be posing as many of them as I can in the period after our two discussants. I also want to let you know that this session is being recorded and the recording will be made available on EGAP's website a few days after this event. With all of that, I now want to turn the virtual podium over to Mark Croker for some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Annette, and it's very good to see you all. I am reminded of a conference I just attended in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, and I heard from multiple West African countries on their national plan for community policing. I was very excited to hear their stories and to hear their presentations about a national consensus. And it occurred to me that each of these organizations, each of these countries, Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, and others, have a history that led them to that point. And so I would like to mention a word or two about the history that we have in our country leading us to where we are today and the future as we see it. But before I do, I just want to thank Annette and FHI 360 and also EGAP and the leadership there. Graham Blair is going to talk to us about the wonderful work that has been done, enormous undertaking that we all can learn from. And so it's a pleasure and an honor, and I thank you for inviting me to be here. But let's talk a little bit about the history that brought us to our point in American community policing. I will refer to 4 eras, and I want to tell you because of the tenure that I've had in my career across now more than 5 decades, I have lived in all of these. First era I call the Lone Ranger era of community policing. That's when community policing was alive, but really it was unnamed, and individual officers or agencies had various programs and things, but there was little taxonomy, as you will. The town sheriff held forth with town meetings and the like. Then the second era would be the community relations era. That began in the 1960s when I actually joined law enforcement. The Vietnam War, the Flower Children, Kent State, you know, the race riots, the things that we all know and recall as we look at the history. Not all of us lived it. I lived it, and but I saw the age of community relations as we tried to build a bridge between police and communities, but there was something missing always, because in the end it was a bridge between us and them. And as one police officer said, it continued to be, you know, we're cops and you're not. And so we stood on one side and them on the other, and it was not the best of eras. Then the third era, I call this the golden era of community policing. That was when in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, the birth and adolescence of maturity of community policing really began in earnest. And there we saw the concept of community policing. We saw the neighborhood focus. We saw the community engagement. We saw problem-solving approaches. We saw the focus on small areas and small entities. Partnerships were being built. We looked at the various literature, you know, the broken windows literature, and we all learned from James Ardrey's book, Territorial Imperative. And we built community policing over in this country, and it took on around the world. Police de proximité, as they say in Francophonie, you know, that all began. But one of the things that we learned during that era, the golden era, was that community policing is not a program. It's not something that you bolt onto an organization. It is, in fact, the structural transformation of law enforcement entities. And as a long-term advocate of community policing, let me just declare right here that it's never the wrong time or the wrong place for community policing. If you describe it as a bolt-on, there will be failures. But what is the community policing I've known in that golden era? It's a philosophy for actually reducing crime and the fear of it. It orients police attitudes and energy to communities. It focuses on specific territories, neighborhoods, identifying, solving problems, building partnerships, and with a role and responsibility for everyone. And I can attest that if it's done in the right way, at the right time, it will reduce crime, fear of crime, improve quality of life, improve the police-community relationship. And so I've seen that actually happen in measurable ways in various places, as Annette said, where I've launched community policing initiatives. The fourth era would be the homeland era. I call it the homeland era because, in my opinion, that era started on September the 11th of 2011. On that day, everything changed, and nothing changed, but a lot changed. A big blow to community policing was September 11th, in my opinion. Why is that? Well, because the term homeland emerged and intelligence-led policing emerged, and we were all kind of taken off of the track of where we were going with community partnerships. Instead, we really started focus on intelligence and the things that could harm our communities and harm our nations. And so now, as we come to the end of that, I think we're coming to the end of that era, and we are at a tipping point now. And so we face the fifth era, and that will be the era yet to come. In the next months, in the next years, there will be a writing moment, I hope, for this writing moment as we grapple with the kind of policing our communities really want. And I believe we are poised for a new day in community policing, in my opinion. And in my opinion, community policing, if it's not done piecemeal, but if it's a total transformational restructuring, that many of us are still talking about, it can really help. I asked someone on a flight recently to Toronto, a man sitting next to me. I said, "So what do you think?" We had a nice conversation. "What do you think is the problem in our communities today? Is it apathy or is it ignorance?" And he said, rather sardonically, "I don't know and I don't care." Well, I'm very happy to see that there are a lot of people who do care about it, and institutions like EGAP and Annette's organization who are looking at it this very day today attests to the fact that we are looking at it in its various components. But I think if implemented correctly, if developed, and I'll close with this word, if developed with a police leadership consensus, if developed with official support at all levels, with champions, leaders that really promote it, if the rank and file are on board, and if a plan is developed that includes everyone and then launched at a certain point, like I heard in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, then it can be effective and it can have measurable impact in those things that really matter to all of us. And that's being safe and feeling safe, improving the trust between police and communities, and also in building those partnerships that produce a quality of life in neighborhoods that is sustainable over time. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back to Graham now, as we'll hear from him, and I'm very excited to hear what he has to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thanks to Annette and FHI 360 team for organizing this conversation, and to Juliana Mott also for discussing the work. Really looking forward to the conversation. And thanks, Mark, for setting this up and giving us a sense of the history of this intervention that I'm going to try to develop a set of evidence about whether this set of policy changes to police practices is effective in a number of settings in the Global South. So as Annette said, my name is Graham Blair. I'm an assistant professor of political science at UCLA and also a member of EGAP. I'm the chair of the Community Policing Metaketa project that I led with Fotini Christia at MIT and Jeremy Weinstein at Stanford, working with 20 social scientists and 6 police agencies in the Global South to test the effects of community policing. So as Annette introduced, this is a project of EGAP, a global network of researchers and practitioners, and this work sits in EGAP's Metaketa initiative. So one of the concerns about how evidence from randomized trials accumulates to inform policy decisions is that experiments are conducted often in one place at one time, and it can be hard to know whether those results travel to other contexts where policymakers currently face a decision. And so the Metaketa initiative represents a new approach to addressing this problem, which is to run multiple experiments in multiple contexts to not only try to learn what works, but where. So EGAP has run 4 other Metaketa projects on information and accountability in elections, on taxation and stewardship of natural resources, and a new one is being started now on women's empowerment. So today, I'm going to talk to you about the problem of crime and insecurity in the global South. The past half century have seen really big improvements in violence around the world. Deaths from war have declined really substantially since the end of World War II. But hidden in that trend is that organized crime and homicide has, in many regions of the world, actually been on the rise. And so today, 1 in 4 people, 1.5 billion people, are living in contexts of violence and insecurity. As a result, reducing crime and insecurity now stands at the top of the global policy agenda. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015, commit countries to achieve just, peaceful, and inclusive societies with a focus on insecurity due to crime and violence. And at the same time, with widespread Black Lives Matter protests against police abuse in the US and around the world, the issue of how to address inequalities in the criminal justice system and rein in police abuse has really never been more salient. The most prevalent policy solution to reducing crime and building secure communities start with the police. Since the origins of modern policing in the early 1800s, societies around the world have relied on a professional, uniformed, and regulated authority to prevent crime and maintain order. But the creation of modern policing also generated a set of problems of its own. Politicians and governments have interfered with the police for political gain. The police themselves have misused their coercive capabilities, which is the driving concern behind the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. And police have faced the important challenge of maintaining the respect and trust of citizens, which is what I'll focus a lot of my attention on today. So why is trust important? A starting point is that we have a need for the legitimacy of the state's law enforcement agency in democracies. We also care about trust instrumentally because of its links with police effectiveness. Effective policing really requires the cooperation of citizens who provide tips about future crimes and evidence about past offenses. When citizens don't trust the police, often they don't cooperate with enforcement efforts. Trust in the police, though, varies considerably across the world. In Latin America, where we conduct 2 of our experiments, less than half of citizens trust the police. This ranges up to the US and Western Europe, where it's much higher. And in fact, in many Western European countries, police trust the police more than their neighbors. Of course, we shouldn't be confused even in these contexts. There's a large minority-majority trust gap. In the US, for example, Black and Latino Americans hold much lower trust in the police than do white Americans. And this gap can really be found around the world between majority and minority. So this raises one of the central problems that societies face in reducing crime, which is that many policies that are designed to reduce crime have the side effect of reducing community trust in the police. And so we can see examples kind of all around the world: stop and frisk policies in New York City, pacification campaigns in Rio in Brazil, and the many broken windows policing efforts around the world, all of which have aimed to reduce crime, but had this effect of undermining citizen trust and then cooperation with the police. So as a result, we ask in this research whether we can reduce crime while building positive community-police relations. And we do so by testing the idea of community policing, which, as Mark has indicated, is one of the most celebrated police reforms in recent decades. There are a number of different definitions of what this means, but community policing at its core is a strategy for encouraging the public to act as partners with the police in preventing crime and promoting security based on the particular needs of their own community. So what I want to do here in the next few minutes is to try to convince you and Mark that what we did was implement what a practitioner or scholar of community policing would call a reasonable model of community policing as implemented in practice in contexts in the global South. And I'll show you that what we find in general is that it doesn't seem to live up to its promise. We find limited evidence in 3 cases of effects on citizen attitudes towards the police, but no effects in other settings. And we'll argue that a set of structural constraints in these contexts seem to have held back its effectiveness. So community policing often has 4 core components. The first is frequent local beat patrols, where individual officers are assigned to a particular beat and regularly patrol there to get to know citizens and local business owners and gain their trust. The second is decentralized decision-making, where the authority to decide about how to allocate police effort is decentralized to those beat officers and their commanders. The third is community engagement, which is a set of interventions where town halls bring police and citizens together so that citizens can learn about the police and the police can learn about concerns from citizens about the community. Finally, problem-oriented policing is a set of strategies for addressing underlying problems that cause crime that are identified through beat patrols and community engagement. So to give you a sense of how this might work, local beat patrols and town hall meetings are meant to generate crime prevention tips for the police that then shape how the police respond to underlying problems in the community, either through problem-oriented policing strategies or through these local decision-making by beat cops and their commanders. These police responses are then meant to generate lower crime and decrease perceptions of insecurity. I want to highlight here the central role that citizen trust plays. So citizen trust is required, as I noted, for citizens to cooperate with the police and provide crime prevention tips. And local beat patrols and town hall meetings are meant to create new relationships between police and citizens and build citizen trust. But citizen trust is also shaped by police responsiveness, how police respond to the set of concerns that are raised. So many people advocate for community policing. It's in wide use across the world, including to some degree in all but one of our study countries, Liberia. It's in use in every continent. In the US, where we have kind of good data on its adoption, about 30% of US police agencies have adopted some form of community policing, and 90% of the largest ones have. The International Council of Police Chiefs, an important advocacy organization, says that it should be a key operational philosophy in police agencies around the world. It's a core training, it's a core part of the training for post-war police agencies that were created in Iraq and Afghanistan after the wars. And UN peacekeeping has it as an essential part of its police training of police agencies. Finally, it's been a kind of key policy response to the demands for reductions in police abuse in the Black Lives Matter movement. There is existing research on community policing. There's a number of randomized controlled trials and other studies. Nearly all of these past studies are in the US, the UK, and Australia. They largely focus on two particular aspects of community policing and not this set of interventions together. In particular, they focus on the increasing community presence of the police through beat patrols and also problem-oriented policing strategies. Largely, these are found to reduce crime, but there is kind of mixed evidence and really limited evidence on whether these interventions affect trust, which is this kind of key outcome that we also really care about. There's almost no evidence from the Global South, which is a gap that we hope to fill here. And also, most of these studies examine these components of community policing separately, whereas we're going to study them together to try to understand whether these different components come together and interact in important ways, given that they are implemented together typically. So what did we do? We implemented this Metaketa study. It's 6 randomized trials in 6 contexts in the Global South. In each of those places, in randomly selected locations, we implemented this set of locally appropriate community policing practices developed in partnership with our police agency partner. And then we ran a set of standardized surveys and collected crime data afterward to try to measure the effect of these community policing practices. So we selected a randomized trial design because our goal is to compare outcomes in places that have community policing and those that don't. The problem is that police agencies that have difficulties with community relations may choose to adopt or be forced to adopt community policing and other kinds of reforms like this that are meant to improve those community relations. And so if we compare places that have community policing to those that don't, they may differ in their underlying levels of pre-existing community trust. And so the solution of this randomized trial design is to use a lottery to pick which areas adopt community policing, and then we're able to compare otherwise similar places that did or did not adopt community policing. So we worked with 6 teams of 20 researchers who had developed a partnership with a relevant local police agency who really wanted to learn about whether community policing practices were a useful tool in their context to reduce crime and build trust between citizens and the police. These teams worked with the steering committee to harmonize this intervention so we could learn about a common model of community policing and a set of common measures so that we can measure in surveys the effects of these in a comparable way across these 6 contexts. We conducted an ethics review in each site and developed a set of risk mitigation measures to make sure that there was no harm done by this intervention. I'm happy to talk about that more during the Q&A. So we worked in 6 countries: Brazil, Colombia, Liberia, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Uganda. And I'll introduce each of the study sites briefly now. So we first worked in Santa Catarina state in southern Brazil. This is a relatively wealthy industrial state, which has crime that's lower relative to elsewhere in Brazil, but still very high in absolute terms. That's an area with some spectacular attacks by organized crime. And we worked with the Santa Catarina military police to conduct an experiment to understand whether community policing could be a tool to reduce crime here in 196 neighborhoods over the course of 7 months, expanding an existing program that this police agency had implemented called Rede de Vizinhos. The second context that we worked in was the city of Medellin in Colombia. Aspects of community policing have been implemented in Medellin in the past, but not regular community meetings, which is what we built on here. In the 1980s, this is the home of Pablo Escobar. It was the most violent city in the world, and police had a really fearsome reputation for extrajudicial violence. Since then, there's been a really marked improvement in crime, but there hasn't been a response in terms of increasing citizen trust. So to try to address this problem, we worked with the Medellin Metropolitan Police and implemented a community policing experiment across most of the city in 350 police beats over the course of a year. The third site we worked in was the capital city of Liberia, Monrovia. We worked with the Liberian National Police, which is a new force that was constituted since the end of the Civil War in 2003. This is a context of ongoing high crime and vigilantism. Almost a quarter of communities report having an active vigilante group in their community. And it's also a place that has a history of really limited state reach. So people have little experience interacting with the police and so don't know some of the basic procedures for how to report on police abuse or report on crimes. This is the first time community policing is being implemented in Liberia. Fourth, we worked outside of Lahore in the Sheikhupura region in Pakistan. This is an area with lower crime than our other 6 contexts, but in Pakistan, the police are among the least trusted institutions. There's a number of reasons for this. Police are constrained to investigating really minor crimes. They need the help of a magistrate judge to investigate larger ones. And there's a perception that political connections are required for police to be responsive. So we partnered with the Punjab Provincial Police and worked across 108 beats over the course of 6 months to test out a set of increased community policing practices. Fifth, we worked in the Philippines. We worked in Sorsogon province, and the Philippines National Police is an agency that's associated correctly with President Rodrigo Duterte's drug war and its campaign of extrajudicial violence in other parts of the country. Nevertheless, citizens, even though it's not taking place in Sorsogon province, still associate the police with this, and so this has really undermined trust. This is also a province that has a low-level insurgency, and we worked in areas that were outside of active fighting. So we partnered with the National Police and implemented this experiment in about 300 barangays, which in urban areas are kind of like neighborhoods, and in rural areas are kind of like villages. And so we did this over the course of about 17 months. Finally, we worked in Uganda. Community policing was tried in one community near Kampala, Uganda's capital, about 15 years ago, but it was determined to be a failure. This project was started from the premise in conversations with the Office of the Prime Minister and the Ugandan police force that the model might be effective if it was tried in rural areas of the country. So that's what we did. We worked in 72 police stations across the country in rural areas over the course of 13 months. And I think one of the challenges with working with the police here is that the Ugandan police serve a dual role. They work to prevent crime, but they also are a tool of the ruling party to try to maintain power. So we tried to separate those and focus on this, this role of preventing crime. Trust in the police is relatively low because of this dual role, but it's kind of in the middle of the pack for places in sub-Saharan Africa. So those are six contexts, and I want to emphasize the diversity of these contexts. Half were democracies, half were autocracies. There was wide variation in how corrupt these places are, from a high in Uganda to a low in Brazil. And they range from some of the poorest places in the world in Liberia to upper middle income countries in Colombia and Brazil. So if community policing practices like we implemented work or don't, in these places, it's going to be instructive about whether it's going to work in other parts of the Global South. What we implemented was a set of locally appropriate increases in community policing practices that were developed in partnership and conversation with our police agency partners. And in particular, there were 4 components that we generally implemented. The first in all the settings was town hall meetings between citizens and local police commanders. In these meetings, citizens shared concerns and highlighted community problems that lead to crime, and local police commanders attended and provided information about criminal justice procedures, including how to report crimes. Second, we increased the frequency of foot patrols in half of the settings. Third, we introduced citizen feedback hotlines for anonymously reporting crime and police abuse. We either created them or widely marketed them as part of these several interventions. And finally, we introduced forums for existing neighborhood watch or community watch groups, which are, just like in the US, informal groups organized locally that aim to complement efforts by formal security services. And these watch forums are meant to formalize these groups and engage them to cooperate with police rather than to act fully independently. So in all cases, some form of town hall citizen police meetings were held. In about half the context, foot patrol frequency was increased. In half, we introduced or marketed citizen feedback mechanisms. In half, these watch forums were created to formalize these neighborhood watches. And the community policing programs lasted between 6 and about 17 months. After we implemented community policing, we conducted a set of harmonized measurements to try to understand how these affected kind of the key outcomes that we care about in this space. So we measured 4 sets of outcomes. The first was security. So we conducted a gold standard victimization survey of citizens and drew on measures of perceived insecurity. Second, we conducted a citizen survey on perceptions of police capacity, responsiveness, and intentions. Third, we conducted a survey of police officers to try to understand their perceptions of citizens and also norms of behavior within the police. And finally, we measured citizen cooperation in terms of tips to the police and reports of police abuse. All in all, we conducted 17,000 citizen interviews in these 6 contexts, 650 interviews with officers, and we collected data on crime from the police in 600 neighborhoods, villages, and districts. What we find overall is that in the 6 contexts, there is no impact on security, on trust, or on cooperation. We find limited positive results on some citizen attitudes, and I'll describe those in a moment, but only in 3 of the contexts. So I'll show you this full set of the top line results. So to orient you to this plot, on the x-axis here, we have the impact of community policing from negative to positive. So first I'm going to show you the effects on crime victimization up here at the top. If community policing works, it should reduce crime victimization. So we should see an effect below 0, and the statistical range of effects should be below 0. That's not what we see. We see a small negative effect, but the statistical range or confidence interval includes some positive and some negative effects. So we can rule out large improvements in crime victimization, and we can also rule out large backlashes or positive effects. Next, I want to show you the effects on our core measurement of trust, which is overall perceptions of the police, this 3rd measure here. Here, trust should go up if community policing is working, so we should see a positive effect. Again, that's not what we see. We see that there aren't improvements, and there also doesn't appear to be a backlash. Okay, so when we look across all of the effects together, the effects on crime victimization, perceived future insecurity, this measure of trust, police perceptions of citizens from our officer survey, measure of police abuse, reporting of crime tips, and police abuse reporting, we see that there are no significant changes in our top level outcomes. Overall, across our 6 contexts, community policing does not seem to lead to the changes that are expected by its advocates. However, we do find mixed findings on citizen attitudes. As I've just shown you, we don't see a change in our core trust outcome in any of our 6 contexts or on average. But we do see improvements in perceived police intentions in Liberia and Pakistan, and a small improvement in perceived police capacity in Colombia. We don't see the reverse of those in the other contexts, and so we regard these as sort of tentative effects that may be context delimited. So overall, why did community policing fall short? We've conducted a kind of informal ethnography of these police agencies while working with them over the course of the last 3 years. And there are three structural problems that we identified that may have held back these results, and these are our speculations. So the first is a lack of prioritization by police leadership, that in some cases there was a rolling back of the engagement by central police leadership. And also we saw that in some cases station leadership were not as on board as the central leadership that we partnered with and that we're really excited about community policing. Second, we observed rapid rotation in some contexts of line officers and their station leadership, which may have undermined their ability to build trust in their communities. And we saw in almost all of the contexts a limited capacity to address community concerns. And so identifying what the underlying problems leading to crime in communities are, it's not going to be very helpful if the police ultimately can't respond to those concerns. So in terms of the officer rotation, in many sites, officers were regularly rotated between stations. And in the 4 sites we were able to measure, we see that this is sometimes quite rapid. So in Pakistan and the Philippines, officers were rotated on the order of 1 to 3 months. So we can imagine that this could really undermine your ability to get to know the community and to build trust and gain citizen cooperation. Second, in terms of capacity and resource constraints, some of our contexts are serving huge populations with few officers and few resources. So in Liberia, a $3,000 per officer budget is less than 5% of the budget in Brazil, and is serving a population of 1,000 people per officers compared to about 300 in Colombia. So in terms of policy implications zooming out from these experimental results, we think that structural reforms, larger structural reforms to the police may be needed for these incremental changes to police practices to yield changes to security or citizen trust. So this may look like changes to the incentives of officers and police leadership to tie them to building citizen trust and reducing crime, or the creation of mechanisms for citizens to hold police to account for failures to deliver, rather than just sharing their concerns, holding officers to account for responding to them. Second, efforts to improve citizen police relations that have been shown to be effective in global north contexts may fall short in police agencies without the resources to respond to these community concerns. And so it may be the case that this type of intervention is effective in some types of contexts, but not those that we tested it in. Finally, the rapid rotation of line officers and station leadership may interrupt police reform. Because community policing and a number of other police reforms rely on citizens getting to know the police and vice versa, when there's rapid rotation, that local knowledge and those relationships really can't be built. So where do we go next? We think that thinking about changes to the incentives of leadership, embedding officers in communities for longer periods, and pairing community engagement with citizen accountability tools may be ways that we can think about building onto community policing to try to make this an effective intervention in the range of places that it's now being implemented. So that's all of our message. We worked with 6 teams in Brazil, Colombia, Liberia, Pakistan, and the Philippines who are happy to engage with you about the country-specific results. And you're welcome to reach out to me with questions. I'm happy to share our kind of scientific working paper. So thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you, Graham. I'm waiting to have my video turned back on by the host. There we go. Thank you so much, Graham. This is it's fascinating research, and I know there are a lot of questions. Before we move to Julie, we had a couple clarification questions that I thought I'd go ahead and ask first so that you can clarify, and then we can start the discussion. We had a couple questions just around what the plans were, I think, originally, and the plans are now for rolling this out. So a lot of times when we see trial research, the question is, this was an experiment with a small group. Did you start with, or are there plans now to roll out these interventions more widely?
Thanks. We've been working since the beginning of the inception of this with these 6 police partners to try to build the evidence that we're collecting directly into their decision-making practices. And I know that in several of the contexts where the police agencies and our research team felt like there were some initial positive results, they are considering both longer-term measurement to find out whether some of these effects persist before deciding whether to roll this out further. And in other cases, I think are feeling somewhat sanguine about community policing as an intervention after seeing some of these results. So I think it has depended on that. COVID obviously interrupted our in-person dissemination plans, but we were able to already meet with 4 of this sets of teams before COVID hit, and are engaging kind of remotely to continue the conversation about how these results that I've just presented to you can affect those decisions.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham. Over to you, Julie.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to FHI 360 and EGAP for this opportunity, and to Graham and the researchers, police officers, and community members who led and participated in this research. Access to this kind of research is critical for those of us in government hoping to make better decisions about how and where to use very limited resources. So much so that my office, the new Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention, is initiating what USAID calls a learning agenda to develop an evidence base for what works to prevent armed conflict and violence. So I'm particularly pleased to be a part of this conversation today. From a security sector reform practitioner perspective, the findings raise 2 questions. First, why, or rather why not? And second, what next? So why didn't we see the expected improvements in citizen trust, crime reduction, or police citizen cooperation? Graham discussed some of these in his presentation already. Let me share a few others, building really on Chief Croker's opening remarks. So I would argue that the preconditions for successful community policing were not in place in any of the countries examined, even in countries like Uganda, which theoretically had community policing on the books since the late 1980s. Community policing is a sophisticated style of policing. Even in the United States and other developed countries, it took decades to evolve from a prototype to widely disseminated practice. And although it's often used as shorthand to describe relationships between communities and police, true community policing requires changes to every part of a police organization, from supervision and management to financing and budget to training, investigation, patrolling, and beyond. What you see on the street has to be mirrored organizationally and functionally in the back office. And I think that that disconnect is mirrored in Graham's findings. Community policing requires a force to think of itself as a service, and it calls for a level of deconcentration and decentralization that might be anathema in countries where police are part of a national or a federal structure. I think the findings of the Metaketa speak directly to the challenge of applying community policing to contexts which simply might not be ripe for it, particularly those that are fragile, emerging from conflict, or suffering from widespread violence. In many of the countries where I've worked, police often use community policing to instruct the population rather than to listen to them. That whole approach subverts the ideal of community policing, making a tool of government control rather than a means of enabling public safety. And alarmingly, it risks bringing predatory and corrupt behavior closer to the population rather than protecting them from it, as the Uganda case study actually bore out. So now to the second question, what next? Even without a formal community policing approach, there are countless reasons why communities and police need each other. So how do we design our assistance to enable the preconditions for stronger community policing partnerships? Let me offer 2 brief suggestions focused for simplicity's sake on supply and demand. Let's start with demand. And for those of us focused on security sector reform, our assistance usually begins with a focus on the police in an effort to strengthen their effectiveness or legitimacy, or both, not on the populations they serve. So I suggest we flip this approach on its head and ask first, what does the community actually want? Safety and security, yes, but for whom and from what? And the answers aren't always what you expect them to be, and they may not align with what the police think or even need them to be. And for anyone in the United States, we're obviously experiencing this disconnect right now. And COVID-19 has only exacerbated the gap between communities and police globally. So what I think communities ultimately want is to enjoy their rights and freedoms. They want freedom from harm, including from the government, and freedom to pursue political, social, economic, and religious liberty. So what does that mean for police? On the supply side, I suggest that reform efforts should begin with a focus on rights-based policing. In the United States, as Chief Croker elucidated, our police style arrived from political policing to professional policing to community policing. So there's an assumption that that evolution would apply in other countries. But many of our partner organizations were never professional to the standard that we imagine when we use the term. So leapfrogging to community policing was always going to be fraught with challenges. A rights-based approach strengthens police professionalism. It's predicated on the relationship between governments and their security agents as duty bearers on the one hand, and community members as rights holders on the other. Police reform efforts then would focus on strengthening laws, policies, and procedures that enable the accountability that will ultimately be the basis of community policing down the line. And at least one of the countries in the cases, the Philippines, has embraced the idea of rights-based policing to the point where they actually train their officers in it. I think ultimately this more balanced approach can enable citizen security and put in place the building blocks for community police partnerships that can withstand the stresses that today's complex world presents. Thank you, and let me turn the mic to Ahmad.
Thank you. My colleagues have already elucidated on a lot of very interesting elements. What I can express from my understanding as a practitioner, I would like to share some of my thoughts to you all. And what I can say is, as a professional police officer coming from a country which is challenged in every front, and having to address the issues often on an ad hoc basis, I have the practical experiences of policing at a front, confronting the street level issues, and later as a senior police officer confronting the strategic issues and the usual challenges which I guess, are very abnormal realities of political interferences, resource crunches, and lack of directions and deviations from its mandates in some of the developed worlds. And with my engagement with the United Nations, I've had the experience of working on various regions of the world and experienced the policing realities, challenges, and the very innovative indigenous ways of addressing the social and community discontent and resolve their differences. So what I want to really emphasize on the onset is, today, there has been a paradigm shift on the notion of security. But many countries continue with the culture and the structures that are not tuned to the new understanding of the security as such. The notion of security has long been interpreted as a security of a territory from external aggressions or a protections of a national interest, to protect the state authority, political setups, and the regimes were all part of the national security. And consequently, the security setups were often built with that objectives in mind. Today, there is a total shift in the concept of security towards human security, which encompasses the people-centric comprehensive approach with prevention-oriented responses that strengthen the protections and the empowerment of all people. Now, when we talk about the community policing, in a culture where their cultural aspect is totally to protect the certain interest and not to serve the public, some of the activities that we underline becomes simply an activity to get a very short result, not a sustained result. So what I say is the core of the community policing is the premises that effective policing is the result of a strong and positive relationship between people and the public they serve. The strong and positive relationships are the basis for the police legitimacy, which Graham exclusively mentioned in his presentations. And the legitimacy is a belief and is reflected in the public trust and confidence on the police, whereby people believe police are honest, they do their job impartially, and they protect each other from crime, criminality, and violence, equally, and that the people have a full willingness to defer to the law and to the police authority. I think this is the basic premises that community policing strives to achieve in principle. And the basic principle is the appreciation of the value of the citizens' input into the public safety. Communication between the police and the public is extremely important for the success of the community policing, and the communications must always be two-way. And that is where we build the legitimacy of the police. And when we talk about the legitimacy of the police, it needs to have the trust and confidence of the public, as I already mentioned earlier. And how do you build that trust and confidence? Is if the police is professional, they know how to do the business appropriately, they know the rules and regulations of the business appropriately, and they make the citizens, others, beneficiary, confident that they are not going to really undermine their priorities. So that's where the people do have the confidence and trust, and that's where this legitimacy comes in. Now, as we all discussed, and Mark already mentioned earlier, the community policing must incorporate responsiveness, consultations, mobilizations, and problem solving as the strategy. And these strategies, as I have seen in most of the places that I have worked, they are the activities implemented on the basis of the individual awareness, individual interest, and individual proficiencies, but not contextualized to the locally based realities. And this is where sometimes all of the efforts that we put in goes into waste. And in most of the instances, police are often used to control the community rather than engaging them as a partners. And Julie also mentioned it earlier. Community policing becomes the tool for managing the public rather than sharing the responsibilities. I would also like to highlight that community policing largely depends on the political character of the government and their commitment towards the public safety and security, which I already alluded earlier when I discussed about the paradigm shift in the nature of the security that we contemplate. As I've observed, the community policing success lies in the overall appreciations on the need to change the policing culture, the structure, and the organization that supports the approach. Now, let me cite an example. I took an assignment in one of the post-conflict countries, which I'm not going to name the country, but that country has been perpetually going on a conflict. And every major international community have been involved in building the national capacity of the countries in every front. And we from the United Nations had a very light footprint as a UN peacekeeping operations, but we had a country team that had a much more larger involvement in the development footprint. And I took up an assignment as a chief technical advisor supporting the police program of that particular agency. And I was working on a police professionalism program, and which inadvertently is the community-oriented policing was a main key pillar. So I inherited a project which encompassed all the fancy aspects of the community consultations, school visit, neighborhood policing, people-centered community engagement activities, and all those that we think about building the trust and confidence. And one of the features that was very successful and which was giving a very good responses to our engagement was the community engagement and the interactions with the community. And a country which was beset with the tribal war, tribal conflict, terrorism, and so many factors, it was very difficult to bring the community closer and discuss issues with the police, but that program was really yielding some results. So I was very pleased to see the reports and all those things, but I had not encountered in actual how the community interactions were going on. So one day I had the chance to go and look into that particular program. I went there, it was running for 4 days, and it was the end of the sessions. And I was there for the whole day. I was very pleased with the interactions. There were police officers, generals, and all those big shots with heavy uniform, very immaculate uniforms. and the religious leader, local leader, woman group, business group, everybody, they were very, very casual in talking, interacting, sharing the problems. And at the end of the day, I had to give a briefing. I had to give the closing session remark. And I said, I am so pleased to see this interaction. I never anticipated in this environment that you guys are talking so casually and informally and sharing your pleasure and displeasure and all these things. I'm very proud of it. And I looked into the police officer, being a police officer, I looked into the police officer and said, I'm so pleased that you are so close to the community and interacting these issues together. And I'm so happy that you are keeping the public as the beneficiary and you are accountable to the public. And you know your uniform, beautiful uniforms are the byproduct of the people's taxes that they pay and that you're getting, your salaries are coming from people. All those issues that normally we talk about, you know, the concept of a people-centered approach. So when I raised this issue, suddenly there was a little bit of a commotion and I could see the frowning faces of the generals around. I looked into my interpreter and said, did you make something wrong in my translations? He said, no. And I said, what is wrong with the generals? And still there was some kind of uneasiness among them. And suddenly one general stood up and says, this people has nothing to do with what we get and how we approach our business. We do our business on the basis of what we are ordered to do, and we are not accountable to the people, and they are not the one who's paying for the salary that we get, or the benefits that we get, or the authorities that we get. So I felt like jumping out of the room from there and saying, where is the community policing, the principle, the basic fact of the community as a basic foundation going to go if the generals, if the police officers have that kind of a mindset? So I was really disappointed. And this is exactly what is there when we talk about implementing programs without the realities on the ground and understanding the basic tenets of the issues on the ground. So what my example that I'm trying to indicate is we need to really look into the basic foundations and the cultures and the structures that defines the police. Now, as a UN police officer, let me say something that, you know, and I saw Graham mentioning about the UN police giving emphasis on UN police training with the community policing approach. It is not only on the training. It is the UN police have really moved from mentoring and monitoring to a much more broader doctrinal shift of engaging into the capacity building of the host state police. And when we talk about the host state police, it's not only in the post-conflict environment, but also into the country which are now having a problem of going through the fragile state syndromes and other issues as well. So we are providing the concept with the support, technical assistance, and building the capacity to really be professional. And what we have said in our United Nations today is our approach of policing is a community-oriented policing, equally aligned with the intelligence-led policing, because there are the two faces of one coin as such. So this is our approach these days, and we are trying to really push the community policing agenda as a primary fundamental issues, and not only in the training issues as such. So there has been a doctrinal shift in how we approach our business as such. And today, if you look into the things, the conflicts are not between the two countries where they are talking about the fighting between the borders. The conflicts are inside the countries. The dynamics of the conflict have changed. And basically, the whole issue is now focused on the rule of law, context of rule of law, and the gap, disparities between haves and have-nots. So this is where it is so important that the police plays a critical role in the society to bring the society together, social cohesion, and the community resilience from external pressures. So this is where the policing is so important, and the community policing becomes so important, so vital, that we always need to really put the agenda as a prima facie thing. But if we start to really do the things without understanding the realities on the ground, where they have those indigenous, innovative ideas, and sometimes we try to bring something which is successful in our own context into something which is totally alien, And that totally defeats the whole purposes. So that is why my only suggestion, my only short comment is that community policing is not a panacea for all the problems, but we have to look at it from a much more broader structural, cultural, and all the aspects, so that community policing becomes a philosophy of policing, but not an activity or a program in itself. So this is all I can say at this moment, but I can share my thoughts later.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie and Ahmad. So Graham, I'll let you know that we have a lot of questions here, and I want to make sure that we get to some of them that have been submitted from the audience. But Julie and Ahmad have also given us a lot to chew on. Do you want to take a couple minutes to say something before we launch into the questions and answers from the audience? Or, all right, I'll give you a couple minutes.
Sure, thanks, Annette. And thanks so much for those terrific comments, which I think all three of you really fit together in your message, which is that community policing is, as understood by many of its advocates, is not just a set of activities, but is a way of thinking about how to completely transform police departments. And so I think that if we stipulate that there is a true community policing model that involves cultural changes to the training of deep changes to the training of officers and how they're recruited, as well as these activities. And also if we stipulate that there are some places that are not suitable for community policing yet, that haven't gone through some of those earlier transformations that Julie talked about. I think the way to interpret these results are that community policing, as it's being currently implemented in many of the places that it's currently being implemented, may not be an effective tool, either yet or without an additional set of changes to the reform of the recruitment of officers and all of these other dimensions. But I think it's important to have a set of evidence about whether this is an effective tool in the places it's currently being implemented, in the way it's currently being implemented. And so I think those two things, I don't see them as intention. I see this evidence as saying, in context in the Global South, we tried to work with a set of police agencies to develop a set of practices that they thought would be effective at changing crime and trust in the police, and those weren't effective. And so now our task is to figure out, as Julie said, why that is. And I think it's this set of, I've identified three structural factors. Julie and Ahmad then identified another set of factors involving the culture of the agency. And I think these bigger changes are what need to happen if this is an effective tool. And so I think this opens up a range of opportunities for research to try to add in some of these other elements that are believed to be important. And so I think that's where we should go next. So thanks so much for the comments.
Thank you, Graham. So as I said, we have quite a few questions. I'm going to start with two sets of questions that are about the research itself and how it was conducted that I will pose to Graham. And then I think we have some larger thought questions that hopefully all of our presenters today, our speakers today, can chime in on. So Graham, picking up on some of the things that you and all of the speakers were just talking about, we have a couple questions that are more specifically about what was done in advance or to prepare for these interventions. So one is from Colin Farquhar, who says training and education are important to happen in advance. Recruiting of personnel with good skills and long-term benefits of police organizations is key to community policing. So he's curious what was done in advance of these studies to prepare current personnel for conducting the town hall meetings, et cetera. And a related question then came in from Trevor Service, who also says he agrees with the points Julie's making, that we need to start with a variety of tasks, including establishment of structures, missions, statement vision, political and police buy-in, and so on. So he says, do you think that perhaps this project skipped these processes and started too far down the alphabet at D, E, and F, and therefore the results were examined too early in order to draw conclusions?
Those are terrific questions. I'll start from the first. So I think in terms of training and education and recruitment of officers, this varied somewhat across the 6 contexts. In a number of them, there was a really concerted effort to develop a new curriculum for officers that was developed in a collaboration between the researchers and the police leadership who were advocating for this reform. And so, for example, in Pakistan, there was a 2-week training that was a curriculum about community policing that talked about the SARA model, and that engaged with an understanding of the theory, of this broader theory behind community policing that Mark and Ahmad have alluded to, and also provided specific training about how to run successful community meetings, how to gain trust and effectively patrol communities on foot and in vehicles. And that was true in a couple of the other contexts. I would say that that was our goal, and in some of the contexts, there was less appetite from the police agency to really change the training curriculum, and an inability to change the recruiting of officers for this community policing. And so I think a next set of research really needs to engage with this question about how and who do you recruit to be community policing officers. And I haven't seen a lot of research on that topic, and that's something that's come up in a lot of these conversations. And then in terms of the kind of duration of, I'm sorry, could you repeat the second question?
The second question had to do with, given this understanding that community policing is part of larger structural reform, and that there are many stages that you need to go through before you can really. So it's sort of, yes, did you skip to step D and skip A through C, and therefore are measuring results too early?
I think the answer, again, depends on the context. Only in one of our contexts are we implementing community policing for the first time, which is in Monrovia with the Liberian National Police. In the 5 other contexts, elements of community policing and the philosophy of community policing is something that was part of general policing practices in these agencies before our research team came along. And so I think what we should think in those 5 contexts outside of Liberia, we should think of this as an increase in community policing, in the intensity of community policing implementation. And there are a number of those earlier stages that have taken place in those agencies to try to build stronger relationships with the community and implement aspects of problem-oriented policing. In Liberia, I think it's probably fair to say that some of those steps were skipped. And so I think we see this as an intention to increase community policing in the range of contexts in which it's being implemented. And I think in some of those places, it's currently not possible to implement some of steps A, B, and C that may be needed. And so this is maybe evidence that isn't going to work.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more set of questions about the research. I'm going to ask you to answer them quickly so we can move on to some of the bigger questions about what does all of this mean. But I think measurement is always vastly important, and we've had several questions around measurement from Samuel Jewett, from Richard Callahan, and a few others asking both for just a little more information. So maybe, for example, you could explain what one of the survey questions looks like for both some of the measurements of the dependent variables that we might think of as being qualitative and not quantitative, like how did you measure trust? And then also for some of the independent variables, how were you able to measure things like police rotations? Again, if you could just maybe give 1 or 2 examples to help people conceptualize measurement here.
Sure. We developed a survey that was meant to be able to be appropriate in each of the 6 contexts. So they were conducted in translation and developed by survey research experts in each of these 6 places, but were also meant to be comparable across contexts. And so we drew on past surveys of trust in the police and police attitudes towards citizens. One example question for a kind of core measurement of trust is that we asked whether citizens generally trust the police and generally think that the police are acting, have good intentions towards citizens. And I'm happy to share the full survey instrument. We have really, we were worried that we weren't going to capture this difficult to measure concept of trust, and so used a range of different kinds of questions so that we could try to pick up effects if it was working in a little bit of a different way than we had imagined. And so happy to share some of the results on some of those secondary measures. And then in terms of the kind of independent variables of police rotation, the set of kind of speculations that I provided are things that we were expecting to get positive results from at least a couple of these studies, and so this is our effort to kind of go backwards and try to understand what went wrong and what were some of the things that held this back. And so these are kind of ex post data collection using our partnership with the police. And so the officer rotation comes from, in particular, our officer surveys. So where we asked how long you'd been in your station. So that was collected by us. And then we obtained this information about the budgets through our police partners to try to calculate the number of officers per station, the number of people per officer, and then the budget per officer.
Great, thank you. We now have some questions that I'm hoping members of our panel can weigh in on. 2 questions. So one from Omar Al-Rafi that suggests that after 9/11, the focus has switched to a more intelligence-led militarized practice and tactics of policing. And the police in many countries of the world have adopted such a militarized approach. So he's asking, do you feel that the USA has influenced such a switch from community policing to a more militarized approach globally? And what can be done about that, especially as the USA has been a strong advocate of community policing for decades? And a similar question was asked by Lena Edward. What can international actors do to support national police building a community policing philosophy? How can we best support our partners in their journey towards legitimacy and trust? Because particularly the first question within this set is about the United States, I'm going to look to Mark, Chief Croker first, and then maybe Julie to give us your ideas. And then if Ahmad, you could pick up on the more general question about what international actors could do, that would be great. Mark.
All right, thank you. Very quickly, because I think there are other questions and I want to address this very quickly. The US, yes, has led in community policing, and in, for example, in Liberia, when I went there as police commissioner for 2 years, in fact, I see Michelle Greenstein on a question there, and and then I hear Graham say that this is the first time that community policing was actually attempted in Liberia, but starting the police academy, launching community policing efforts with the Liberian National Police Director in the year 2003 and 4. That was a major shift. Over years, what has happened and can happen everywhere is that the leadership momentum has waned, and so it appears that we're starting all over again, and it happens that way. And I think if community policing, in fact, is embraced as a complete package that includes all of the elements that, for example, were studied in each of these 6 places and in one composite aggregate. And if community policing is not launched by some champion out there in some district or a precinct, but rather it becomes a national consensus. In fact, I have a very quick little, I don't know if you can see this, but the whole idea is that It begins here with elected officials, police leadership being on board, elected officials and appointed officials being on board, then the rank and file, and then you have a plan for implementing on a complete organizational basis, then execute the plan. If you start somewhere in here, you have a champion maybe out there somewhere doing something, or maybe foot patrols or bike patrols or some new innovative thing that is a piece of community policing. It will be piecemeal and it will fail. I've participated, I have to admit, in failures of my own in that regard. But if it is an institution, if it's an institutional philosophy, a doctrine, to use Ahmad's term, and if in all of the U.S. embassies, to answer that question about how can the U.S. with its kind of shift away from the community partnership idea and throughout the embassies, the INL, the international community, USAID, all of us agree that, you know, this is something that can and will work in producing multiple various positive results that are measurable, then yes, we can share, and we can share in lessons that are learned about and perceived failures and fold them into a migration in an evolution of this very important tool in the future. Thank you.
Great. Julie, what would you like to add?
You know, to the point about whether the militarization that we're witnessing in the United States or have witnessed over, you know, since 9/11 is causing that to happen overseas. I would say it was happening on its own. And one of the things that many police reform programs work on is the demilitarization of police overseas, and to separate police from military. They're referred to as forces, but they have completely different mandates and missions, and they should. And a focus on those mandates, I think, helps to reorient the police towards a domestic protection responsibility. And I go back to the points that I made earlier, that this has to be first and foremost about rights-based policing. And I think that in many ways, that's what the United States has to embrace to get back to the point where we can again deliver community policing in a way that's responsive to the needs of the community. That what has happened over time is that somehow policing has become separate and distinct from the rule of law rather than being grounded in it. And we need to sort of return to basics, I think. For many, many years, those of us who have done this work overseas have taken the best practice and the lessons learned of the American experience and brought it to bear in the countries in which we're working. And now is an opportunity for us to kind of do the reverse and look at the places that have, particularly in the Liberias, and even though they're not there on community policing, there are advances that have been made as they stood up a new police organization focused on the things that that a rule of law context would elaborate, like equality under the law and servicing all communities equally.
Thank you. Ahmad, what would you answer to the question about what can international actors be doing now? What should we be doing now to support the community policing philosophy?
Well, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and it is very important that the international, what I've seen from my experiences, there are a lot of international actors who would like to really definitely support the host state police, build their capabilities. They would like to really support in every aspect, but you know, the support also do have certain level of national interest on the side of the givers. Now, this is where it is so important for the national government to really make sure that what they are looking for is tuned to their own expectations and their realities. They need to own the reform process. They need to own what they are inheriting, what they are trying to acquire. Are they capable to sustain it on their own after the international support is gone? because most of the time people are very interested into the fancy things, but they don't look into their capability to sustain those capabilities at the end of the day. And similarly, the concept, the processes, the resources, and the approaches, are they viable in their context or not? That is something that they really need to really take into account before they really launch their initiatives of the reform. So they have to be a little bit mindful in what they are trying to acquire, how they want to make sure that that is nationally owned process, and how they can really steer the whole process according to the indigenous needs, rather than something the international community can come and parachute them with the concept. There are a lot of international agencies, countries trying to help. There are things, United Nations, UNDP. Now, if the member states are really looking forward, I mean, if you look into their own sustainable development goals, where we talk about 16 different goals, and out of 16 different goals, there's a 16th goal, which talks about rule of law, which talks about empowering the policing in the indigenous context. So nationally, you have the opportunity to really influence your need of the police reform. So these are things that you can really, nationally people can look into and address and request the international community, who are always there open with the open arm to support the reform processes. But that is where I always caution the national recipient, be mindful of what you are getting and what you are asking for before you really embark into the reform processes.
Mm-hmm. Just to pick up on, you mentioned about context and how important it is to keep context in mind. And, we have a question here from Bamswagia, I'm sure I said that wrong, Frank, who said, how would you advise on the implementation of community policing amidst COVID-19 and those implications? So while that may seem like a very specific situation, it's affecting everyone and obviously can have a big effect on the ways that we can establish those relationships between communities and police agencies. So maybe Mark and Julie, if you have just a few words on that before we have a wrap-up set of questions.
Well, the beauty of community policing is that any and all problems of quality of life, of freedom of movement, of human rights, all of those questions can be absorbed into the problem-solving approach. What are your needs now in this community versus that one, versus the rural versus the metropolitan? At this particular time with this health crisis or some other wartime crisis, those items can be brought into the discussion for how now, with all of us on one side of the table and the problems on the other side, how should we go about that in partnership? So that's the beauty of community policing, in my opinion.
I would say that COVID-19 really is exacerbating the gap between what police can provide and what communities need.
Yeah.
And in one particular area, every country in the world is experiencing an increase in domestic violence and violence against children and probably elder abuse. And for those of us who work in this space, we know that violence begets violence, and that what begins as domestic violence down the road can turn into collective violence, and victims can become perpetrators. So this is an opportunity for us to really prevent collective violence and community violence that might happen 20 years from now by being proactive and engaging in these areas that we know are happening. So there are a whole host of secondary and tertiary impacts of COVID beyond the health impact that I think police globally should be attuned to.
And if I can, I also would like to add, because I have been involved during this COVID instances, trying to help the police develop their SOPs on how to address this challenges. And what I have seen is in most of the countries, in the developing world, police has been left alone to address the issues. It's a health issues, it's a health security issues, but the police has been thrust upon to enforce the lockdown, to enforce the security measures, and police not having a clear understanding of what its impact and what it is. They have been thrust up onto those tasks, which is disrupting the the relationship between the community and the people. And that is where we came up with the program where we talked about the human rights approach to policing during COVID. And most of the places, the police have been put forward to execute the interest of certain things. Like, for example, the migrants. There are issues in one of the country where that country is running because of the migrants. And now, in order to get rid of the undocumented migrants, they are using the COVID as a pretext, and the police are in front, trying to get rid of these migrants. Now, these are certain things, like, for example, domestic violence. There's no recourses for how to address these domestic violences. And the police have not been given the resources and the educations on how to address these issues. And that is very, very fundamental. And then it is related with the community. And this is where we can really build this concept of community policing.
Great, great. So I'm going to end with a question for Graham. Several of the questions that we've seen in the Q&A, including one from Michelle Greenstein, come down to this question of, we've heard Professor Blair, we've heard our panelists. So does community policing work or not? Or where does it work? And the way that I'll pose that question to you, Graham, is how would you like those who are promoting community policing, who are working with police agencies, how would you like police agencies, particularly in low and middle income countries, which was the focus of this research, how would you like them to use the evidence that was produced by this Metaketa?
Thanks, Annette, and thanks everyone for a really engaging conversation. I learned a ton from your thoughts, and I think for me, the way that this evidence should be used is to just provide some healthy skepticism about the conditions under which community policing is going to work. And I think it should just raise the bar a little bit higher and set up a set of questions that police agencies and their partners need to ask themselves about what stage they are in the process of developing this set of norms within the police agency and between citizens and the police that would indicate that community policing is likely to be an effective tool. And that in these 6 places, what we found was that at a minimum, in the relatively short term, this isn't, as Ahmad said, a panacea. This isn't an intervention that's going to kind of turn around citizen-community relations, at least in these contexts and in the way that these police agencies decided to increase the intensity of community policing practices. And so I guess I would leave with that word, that there's a healthy skepticism here that should lead to more collaborations between police agencies and researchers to try to identify what some of those conditions are that are especially important and maybe are necessary, and what we could do to make it possible for community policing to be effective in the places where it's being implemented.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists today. I want to give a quick shout out to my good friend Greg Giswald, who really helped us to build this panel with so many interesting speakers. Thank you for Graham for sharing in a very short period of time the result of 6 different but related studies, and for Chief Croker and Julie Warble and Ahmad Garang for your insightful comments based on many, many years of experience. Thank you to our participants for joining us today. As a reminder, this session has been recorded and will be made available on EGAP's website, so you and all your friends can watch it as many times as you want to after the fact. What I hope is that this is the beginning of a lot of really fruitful discussions about how we can build the evidence base around improving community policing interventions around the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.